Hi, everyone. Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America, Code Pink's weekly webinar of hot news from Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast every Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, and we bring you 20 to 30 minutes of hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, we're joined by my good friend and fellow activist, Karen Spring. Karen is the ground coordinator for the Honduras Solidarity Network, and I will give a special shout out to the HSN for co-sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you, all of you. And thank you for giving some time of Karen to come and talk with us. And so Karen is Canadian born, and she's reporting to us today from Canada, but she has been working on the ground based in Tegucigalpa since 2009, Karen? I think just after the coup of June 2009, and she has also worked directly with us here at Code Pink in coordinating and leading delegations to Honduras. I think our most recent Code Pink delegation was in 2016, about a year after Berta Cáceres' assassination, or a month.
A couple of months.
It was 2015. She got the Goldman Award, and then thank you. And so that was basically an emergency response delegation that she helped Code Pink coordinate, and there's a great report that came out of that delegation as well that we can make available to all of you watching after the program. So today we have Karen joining us to talk about some of the hypocritical U.S. foreign policy issues facing Honduras, particularly juxtaposed to Venezuela. And then also, we're going to explore how COVID-19 is being manipulated to militarize and privatize the Honduras state. So Karen, welcome. Really nice to have you here in conversation. I'm so happy to see you.
You too, Terry. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So maybe you could take a couple minutes and tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, how you came to this work, and how you got to Honduras, and what your life has been like there.
Sure. So I am the Honduras-based coordinator for the Honduras Solidarity Network. I have been stranded outside of Honduras because the borders are closed. So I was in the US when they closed the borders, and now I'm in Canada, trying to get back to Honduras. But I went to Honduras shortly after the coup in 2009, and I've stayed there ever since. So it's been over a decade that I've been living and working on human rights issues in Honduras. But I want to thank you so much, Terry, for having me and for inviting me on Code Pink's program. It's really an honor to share the space with you, Terry. I guess I'll just get started. Yeah, okay. And
we'll let you share.
Okay, so I guess one of the first things I wanted to do is I wanted to show people a tweet that was put up by the US Southern Command that sort of gives some perspective on Latin America and Honduras. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Hopefully this works. Can you see that, Terry?
Yeah. We can.
Okay. So this is the US Southern Command tweeted this tweet on April 24th, so about 5 days ago. And it's quoting the commander of the Southern Command, Adam Fowler, saying, "We intend to work in all domains because the transnational criminal organizations, the narco-terrorists, operate in all domains as well." And you can see this map down here, which is kind of small, but hopefully you can see it okay. And it has 3 arrows that are sort of showing that there's a narcotics flow from Venezuela. And there's an arrow that goes from Colombia as well, and then into the Guatemala or the Caribbean. But if you notice, Honduras is on this map, but you don't see any arrows sort of focused on Honduras. There's no mention of Honduras at all in this specific tweet, and the focus is very much on Venezuela. And so I think that that is very interesting because we know that Honduras is a narco state and that the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez is involved in state-sponsored drug trafficking. And this isn't me talking, and this isn't my opinion. This isn't Code Pink's opinion. This is what US federal prosecutors have said and made very clear that Juan Orlando Hernandez is a co-conspirator in trafficking, in large-scale drug trafficking, along with his brother, Tony Hernandez, who is now convicted on large-scale drug trafficking and other charges. And in the courtroom in New York, during Tony Hernandez's trial, US federal prosecutors laid out how Tony Hernandez and his business associates, along with his brother and the former president of Honduras as well, Pepe Lobo, worked with El Chapo Guzman and were some of the most, they were the major cocaine supplier for the Sinaloa cartel, which is a transnational criminal drug trafficking organization. And so Juan Orlando Hernandez is still in power, even though it's very well known and documented and in New York that that Juan Orlando Hernandez is linked into these transnational narcotics trafficking organizations. And
so this is, let me just clarify for our viewers, this is last fall's trial of the president's brother, Tony Hernandez, that we're referring to. And in those trial documents, I believe the president himself was referred to as co-conspirator number 4.
Yes. So, yes, so they call him CC4.
Yeah, we've seen his t-shirts on the ground in Honduras, CC4. And what a hope that the CC4s were the new ones last year.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but you don't hear about, the Southern Command is not talking about CC4. They're not calling Juan Orlando Hernandez or the Honduran government a drug state, a terrorist, a narco-terrorist, like they do with Venezuela and other countries. And instead they treat Juan Orlando Hernandez very differently. And so in so many ways, Honduras is like the perfect example of US hypocrisy in the region and in Latin America. You look at how they treat Juan Orlando Hernandez versus Nicolas Maduro and other governments that are not allies of the United States in the region. And so I just want to show a couple of tweets just to show, to sort of show this and recent examples of it. So I'm going to pull up a tweet by President Trump that was tweeted again 5 days ago on April 24th. And he said, "I just spoke to President Juan Orlando Hernandez of the Republic of Honduras. We work closely together on the southern border. We'll be helping him with his request for ventilators and testing." And so this was again on the 24th of April, 5 days ago.
What does he mean by the southern border, Karen? How is the president currently defining the southern border? The U.S.-Mexico border with deportations to Honduras? Or is the southern border of Honduras now considered the southern border of the United States, or both?
So I mean, it's not really clear, but for me, what he's talking about when I read that is that he's referring to the safe third country agreements, or what the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa insists that it's named as the Asylum Cooperative Agreement. And so that means that people that are seeking asylum, that want to seek asylum in the United States, are being sent back to Honduras or Guatemala and El Salvador to basically seek, or so-called be given safe protection in those countries instead of getting that safe protection in the United States. And so he's referring to Juan Orlando Hernandez's cooperation with the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is very much Trump's sort of policy baby. It's been immigration and migration into the United States has been a pillar of Trump's presidency, along with all the racist and white supremacist sort of views and policies that are surrounding those. Some of Trump's pillars. And it's interesting because the Safe Third Country Agreement also between Honduras and the United States links to this COVID-19 crisis. And that's because the Safe Third Country Agreement became legally active in Honduras on March 13th. So this just 2 days before Honduras declared an emergency in the country as a result of COVID-19, they published the law became active. And so now the Safe Third Country Agreement with the U.S. and Honduras is now active in all of this chaos related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Juan Orlando Hernandez may be a narco dictator, according to U.S. federal prosecutors, but he's the United States's and Trump's narco dictator, right? And so, and it's not even that he's a narco dictator, he's a clever narco dictator, because he knows how to also stroke Trump's obsessions on a variety of different issues. And by saying that, I don't want to undermine, the role that the United States has played in Honduras. I mean, regardless of whether Juan Orlando Hernandez is the president or not, the United States has always supported really awful governments and had awful policies towards Honduras.
There's this saying here on the Hill when you talk with legislators who are really familiar in depth with Central America, U.S. policy towards Central America, and people chide that, particularly with Honduras, that it hosts one of the largest U.S. military bases in the region. And you base the government, regardless of who or what it is, basically gets a pass, so to speak, for housing that military base.
Right, which is absolutely absurd, because that military base and is providing all of this cooperative agreements and work with a military that is also mentioned in the New York Southern District Court as being big, like co-conspirators basically, that worked and protected drug shipments and helped move drug shipments for the Sinaloa cartel across Honduras, all parts of Honduras. And so that's obviously very, like, they may have the largest US military base, but they're supporting also a military that is trafficking drugs in Honduras. And so Honduras and Juan Orlando Hernandez is very much the most ideal, Juan Orlando Hernandez is the most ideal US puppet, because he gives them everything that he wants, but he's also trafficking drugs and helping traffic drugs with the Sinaloa cartel. And so I just want to show how Juan Orlando Hernandez really knows how to stroke Trump's ego by showing you a really quick video that came out recently, a few days ago as well. I think like maybe it's within the last week. So I'm just gonna pull this up. It's a very short video. And what Trump is being questioned on is the hydroxychloroquine, the drug that he's basically promoting as being a solution or a treatment for COVID-19.
You can't hear it.
So could you hear that, Terry?
No, I couldn't actually. Could you?
Oh, I could hear it, but I'm not sure if our audience heard it.
I'm not sure either. I don't have any messages here, so.
Okay, well, so if people didn't see it, they can go to, or they didn't hear it. It's really actually interesting. And what he's talking about is he just spoke to the president of Honduras, in case people didn't hear it, maybe they did, but in case not, and that he's this great guy, and that he says that hydroxychloroquine works great, but he doesn't think he's a doctor. Trump doesn't think he's a doctor, but he just spoke with him. So, and told press that they can call the president of Honduras to ask him about the drug. And so Juan Orlando Hernandez probably brought up the topic of hydroxychloroquine to Trump because he knows that Trump's been promoting it, but also because the Juan Orlando Hernandez government, along with the World Health Organization, is testing hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine in Honduras as part of sort of these clinical trials. And it's been met
So
with
they're using the Honduras people as guinea pigs, so to speak? Is that what you're saying? In a way?
Yeah, they're testing these drugs. It's along with the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization is doing this as well. But it's interesting that they're picking that specific drug. And the Honduran Medical College has called what Hondurans are basically calling experiments as unethical, a joke, and an insult to the Honduran people, that these drugs are being used as and being tested in Honduras. And they say this because the government of Honduras has been unable to provide even the most basic biomedical equipment to healthcare workers, and the most minimal prevention measures that are needed to sort of contain the virus. And there's no scientific ability, according to the Honduran Medical College, to actually do these clinical tests. And so it's been met with resistance.
And why is that? Why is there no ability for the government to respond?
Because the healthcare system in Honduras is absolutely and completely depleted.
Public infrastructure.
Yeah, infrastructure, the ability, the support that that healthcare workers are getting, and I'll get a little bit more into that later on. But basically, in addition to talking about hydroxychloroquine to Trump, Juan Orlando Hernández also asked the Trump administration and Trump on the phone, and Juan Orlando Hernández tweeted about this afterwards, for a moratorium on payments to the international financial institutions to sort of help Honduras out and help Honduras deal with this crisis. And so, because the United States has basically the most dominant force on the boards of these and voting power inside the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And so this is a huge controversial topic in Honduras. The money that's coming in from the World Bank to allegedly deal and confront the COVID-19 pandemic is subject to a huge amount of controversy and corruption in the government. And I'll give an example of that. So just 2 days ago, the Anti-Corruption Council released a report showing that the Honduran government has basically siphoned off $2.3 million from contracts that were given to 4 companies to purchase N95 and disposable masks for healthcare workers. And they basically overvalued the contracts to these 4 companies by 2.3 million. And these 4 companies are all linked to the National Party, which is Juan Orlando Hernández's party. And the money that this Honduran government institution is getting to purchase these things, 20 million of it is coming from the World Bank. And so it's a huge controversial topic in Honduras. And Hondurans are saying that none of this money that's coming in from these IFIs are actually getting to the healthcare workers and getting to actually respond to the pandemic. And so Honduras,
for our listeners, IFIs are international financial institutions.
Yes.
So what I hear you describing is basically a theft, a reapportionment of a loan, basically.
Yes. And so when I specifically asked an economist, a Honduran economist, about, would the World Bank in their auditing measures be able to detect this kind of corruption? And he said that they do audit the money, but they don't go into extreme detail. So they don't look at conflict of interest. They won't necessarily look at how there are conflicts of interest between the government giving contracts to people that are married to Congress people that are associated with the National Party and or family members of the National Party in Honduras. And so Hondurans are basically saying this money is not getting to them. And so Juan Orlando Hernández is basically asking Trump for moratoriums on these payments, and also asking these international financial institutions where the US has significant power to give them more money. And Hondurans are saying, but what is Juan Orlando Hernández using the money for? Right? They're saying that he is trying to get as much money as possible using this pandemic to basically fund the next electoral fraud in Honduras. And that there are, several scandals that show that the money is being misused and stolen. And so Hondurans have, and on top of this, like, corruption and these scandals that are coming to light because of this money going into the country, Hondurans have zero faith in the government. And that they're not really believing anything that's being said in terms of public health prevention measures. And so the illegitimacy of the Juan Orlando Hernández government that goes back several years before the pandemic started, before there was, the caravans flooding to the US border, there's been a significant questioning of the legitimacy of the Juan Orlando Hernández government. And it's really undermining any sort of health prevention measures that are being implemented by the government and anyone working with the government, like the World Health Organization. And that's very concerning because it's going to mean that the pandemic is going to hit really hard in Honduras. And for me, watching this as somebody that is focused on US and Canadian foreign policy, it's sad and outrageous to see how the pandemic is unfolding in Honduras. And again, we're seeing the damage that is being done when the US supports real narco dictatorships and real, very corrupt governments in the region, and the poverty and the misery and the total lack of trust in the government to implement very basic public health measures. It's very sad to see, and we see these grave impacts on the Honduran people when the United States backs a government that has no legitimacy nationally. And so even before the COVID-19 crisis, like I mentioned, Honduras was already in a really difficult situation. People can remember back to October 2018, when Hondurans were fleeing Honduras and making the trip up to the US-Mexico border in caravans. And that's not to say that migration wasn't already happening before the caravan started, but the caravan sort of drew extra attention to the number of people that were fleeing the country. And so COVID-19 is only going to make this difficult situation in Honduras even more difficult. And so, Terry, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the context of COVID-19 in Honduras so that people have a good idea of sort of what's going on in terms of like where Honduras is at with the COVID-19 crisis. So currently, as of last night, the Honduran government has reported 738 cases of COVID. There is 66 deaths that have been reported, but these numbers are really significantly questioned by the Honduran Medical College and doctors that are working inside the two major public hospitals. And again, I don't know whether, I can't, obviously, these are government numbers. And so, but I think it's again worth mentioning that there's a lot of reluctance to trust these numbers, which is concerning. The epicenter of the crisis of the COVID-19 infection in Honduras is actually located in the Department of Cortés, where there's a lot of US-owned sweatshop factories and a lot of migrant workers that fled from the rural areas to the cities to work in these sweatshops. And also where the largest Central American port is. So the port that is transporting the bananas, the melons, the t-shirts, and anything that's sort of destined for the US market that is coming from Honduras. And so that's where the epicenter is, and the majority of the infection rate is right in that sort of northern department. The healthcare system has totally collapsed. And Dr. Suyapa Figueroa, who is the president of the Honduran Medical College, told CNN that even before, or when there were less than 550 cases of COVID-19 in Honduras, that the healthcare system had already collapsed, and that there was really no ability for the Honduran medical system or healthcare system to respond to a pandemic, let alone, dengue, which Honduras has been experiencing significant numbers of deaths of dengue, which is a mosquito-borne illness for several last few years. And so the healthcare system's totally collapsed because of all of the corruption scandals and the mismanagement and the efforts to privatize healthcare that dates all the way back, many years. But the focus of that mismanagement and corruption and collapse it goes back to the 2014 Social Security scandal that saw between $250 to $350 million stolen from the Social Security system. And so it's concerning that even with less than 550 cases, the Honduran Medical College says that the Honduran system has already collapsed. There's less than 150 ventilators in the entire country. And so that's also a concerning issue. a lot of people in the public health system are raising concern with the low number of testing that is being done around the country. Apparently, there's only 66 tests that are conducted on average a day in Honduras. And so people, again, that's calling into question the numbers that are coming out of Honduras. And also the ability to know sort of the peak, when the peak is going to happen, and for relevant epidemiological measures to be implemented. And like I mentioned, the mismanagement and corruption of the money that is coming into the country, and that the Juan Orlando Hernandez government is basically using the pandemic as a way to say, you know, we need help. We're in these desperate situations. Please give us money. Please, you know, send this money through the international financial institutions. We need this money, but really Hondurans are saying, we don't really think this money is getting to us. And it's not being used to actually deal with the pandemic. It's actually being siphoned off for the profitable interests, or for the interests of the government, for whatever reason, whatever they plan on using it for. And so there's a public health emergency playing out in Honduras, like there is all around the world, but it's sort of overlapping with an already very dangerous and extreme and difficult human rights situation in the country. And COVID-19 has exacerbated the human rights situation in the country. And so I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So on March 15th, without any warning, Juan Orlando Hernandez imposed an absolute lockdown in the country. And so they call it in Spanish a toque de queda, which means like a curfew. It's the same type of curfew that they imposed in Honduras during the 2009 coup, and also during the 2017 electoral crisis. And so these types of lockdowns are not new to Honduras, and the government has used them before in the last 10 years. But on top of the absolute lockdown, they partially suspended constitutional rights in Honduras. And so the right to freedom of expression was suspended. The right to private property was also suspended. And so if you are found in the streets, or your vehicle is confiscated, your motorcycle can be confiscated, which has been the situation for many people. And they can raid your house. They can basically, you have no right to private property. So the military and police are able to sort of seize anything that they want to, basically. I think you're going to say
something. Can we talk about the seizure of private property just for a little more clarification? So this is private property belonging to obviously a certain segment of the economy, not the wealthy people. And this is people who are just out on the street after curfew. If they've broken the curfew, they can have their private property taken away, or what? How does that work?
So so those are actually really good questions, because so the lockdown is actually permanent. But it's odd, because there's an absolute lockdown, but the government's saying is allowing people to go out once a week, according to the last number of their ID cards. They're able to go to the grocery store, into the pharmacies, etc. And the issue of seizing private property in Honduras, the law says one thing, but it's always applied in a very political way, and in a very sort of class-based way. And so if you're a wealthy person with, like a Toyota Prado, is a type of car that, the wealthy people drive around in, with tinted windows, bulletproof, the military and police are not going to they're not going to, confiscate property of a wealthy person. We're talking people that are poor people, that have to go into the streets, that have to violate the lockdown because they're not able to stay at home, because staying at home for many people in Honduras means stay home, lock down, and starve, because people don't have savings. There was no warning that was given when they imposed the lockdown. There was no week warning. There was no day warning, 1 day earlier warning. It was like, we're locking down. And so you lock down with what you have. And for many Hondurans, the majority of Hondurans, 66% of Hondurans live in poverty. They need to go to the market every day to sell something, to then be able to go to the market afterwards in the afternoon and use the money they've made in the morning sales to buy the food that they take home. And so they can't lock down. And so that's what happens when you suspend constitutional rights and you talk about taking away the right to private property. That means private property for poor people.
And most likely people who didn't vote for the current president.
Right. And so that's another thing that's important to mention as well, right? Because, there's food aid that's being distributed around Honduras, but they're actually distributing it based on the rosters, the electoral rosters of people that voted for the National Party and the party in power, and that's Juan Orlando Hernandez's party. And so what's happening is that people are not only being forced to go on the street, and even if they want to lock down to protect themselves and protect their health, they can't because they need to go and they need to work. But they're also going into the streets to protest because food aid isn't getting to them. And because it's very politicized. And so you have members of the military and the police with people from this social program that's called the Better Life program, which is called the Vida Mejor, which actually also receives World Bank money and money from the international financial institutions. They go and they have this list and they walk into like small rural communities where everybody knows who is who and who votes for who. And they're going and they're delivering food packages to people that are only on the list that they have. And so that's causing massive amounts of outcry. And even, you know, high military commanders in the Honduran military have come out publicly to say this is not okay, this is wrong, and that it should be distributed equally and not based on your political beliefs or your political affiliations. And so that military commander that actually said that got fired. But it's a big issue. And it's also driving people into the streets to protest and violating the lockdown. And as a result, the Honduran military and the police are responding with repression, as they have done for several years. They're tear gassing people that are protesting, that are demanding food aid, that are blocking the roads, and they're firing live rounds. Just 2 or 3 days ago, there was a protest in the northern community of Tela, which is actually a tourist destination for a lot of Canadians, actually. And
it's a lovely town, actually.
It is.
It's a lovely bayside town. It's quite authentic.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place, but it's also subject to a lot of local political issues and land problems and land issues specifically related to the Garifuna people. But so the state security forces fired live rounds and they tear gassed people, and 2 live bullets hit 2 people and they were injured by bullet. And then on the same day, there was also military police that killed a local baker, actually, like a bake shop worker that was returning to his house. And because he was going to work, because that's a lot of people rely on going to work every day, they were trying to pass a checkpoint, and the young boy ended up being killed and his brother injured. And so, you know, Honduras was already in a really difficult human rights situation and context. And the COVID-19 crisis is giving all these extensive powers to the military and police that are basically on the streets trying to enforce this lockdown that might be actually a good idea in terms of public health prevention, but that in a context like Honduras is actually not working out at all. And it's ending up really criminalizing poverty and not sort of considering that people can't lock down. And the efforts that the government has to sort of deal with people that need food and need food aid is not being conducted either in a proper way, because they're basically supporting the people that will vote for them and not for people that may most need the food aid.
You know, this is interesting that you bring this up, and really important. It's basically the politicization and weaponization of food. Basically, weaponizing the food. And there are other countries in the hemisphere that are grotesquely accused of doing that, and yet we never hear anything about their Hernandez government in Honduras behaving this way. And it's just a really gross.
Oh, it's total hypocrisy. Yeah. And I mean, that money that comes from that Better Life program, a lot of that money comes from the international financial institutions. So it's coming from US tax dollars, and it's coming from Canadian tax dollars, and it's being given to the World Bank, and then the World Bank loans that money to Honduras, and then the Honduran government, you know, says, okay, well, we're going to use this program only to support people that support us as a political party and nobody else. And the COVID-19 crisis is no exception to that extreme politicization of aid and food aid, but it's happening at a much desperate time because people need support because they cannot lock down. And so just, I wanted to mention one more thing that's sort of a crisis, and then I'm going to say that it's, show that it's not all gloom and gloom. A lot of people find Honduras rather depressing because it's very difficult. It's been in a very difficult crisis and situation for the last 10 years. But one more difficulty that I think is really important to mention, because it's something that's happening in the United States too, but also it's more extreme and severe in Honduras, is that healthcare workers are walking off the job because there's no biosecurity precautions at all. And that was happening when there were like very few cases of COVID-19 in the country. It's not like they're at maximum pandemic level. They're not at the peak of the curve yet. And the government, again, is not, instead of using the money that they're getting to buy biomedical equipment, they're contracting companies that are siphoning off millions of dollars and pocketing it, instead of it all going to buy biomedical supplies. And so,
it's like the entire population is just disposable.
Yeah.
A good percent, I shouldn't say the entire, but a certain segment of it is.
Well, and it's interesting that as I'm thinking more, I mean, there's so many examples of it. It's not just that, that they're stealing money, but it's that the money that is being purchased or is being used to purchase biomedical security equipment, it's being supplied or given to the military hospital that serves military. And it also is a private hospital. So if you have the ability to pay, then you can go be hooked up to a government, to a ventilator that was bought by government money. So they're not even supplying the public hospitals. They're giving them to military hospitals and prioritizing the health of the military before. And if you go into the streets of Honduras, and there's tons of pictures of this that the Honduras Solidarity Network has put out, is there's all these military in the streets at these checkpoints with N95 masks on and biosecurity, medical gowns on. And then you show that a picture of medical workers in some of the public hospitals and the public clinics, and they don't even have the most basic gear. And so that's just like another example of, what the US-backed narco dictatorship is doing in Honduras, and how they're spending their money and how they're prioritizing any sort of aid that's being given or how money is spent. And so, Terry, just to close down, so we can open it up for questions, and if, in case I missed anything, I want to say that Honduras has been in a difficult, situation for a really long time, and there's no denying it, and it's really a difficult country to work in, but it's also very clear. It's more clear about what's going on there, but it's not all loom and gloom. While people are sort of locking down, there are really incredible, the social movement is coming together very united. And every single week they're putting out communiques with very clear demands about what they want. And people can go to the Honduras Solidarity Network's Twitter or Facebook to look at those in more detail if they're interested. But they're saying that the Honduran Medical College and public health professionals should be the ones leading the response to the pandemic, which has not been the case. Juan Orlando Hernandez has people that are allied to him. They're family members of his people in his political party that have been managing the crisis, which is again undermining the response. And they have several other, the social movement is demanding taking the side of workers that are working in US sweatshops that are being laid off, or their vacation pay is being taken from them. And then for May 1st, because we're a couple days from May 1st, I think 2 days, there's a caravan that is scheduled for people to get in their cars and to go around and do caravans. And they're asking people to hang up banners and notes on their doors and in their windows to sort of resist the narco military dictatorship in Honduras, and to keep up the resistance against the dictatorship and show the illegitimacy of the Juan Orlando Hernandez government. They're organizing cacerolazos, which are pot banging sessions inside their neighborhoods and their houses, which Hondurans also did during the electoral crisis. And communities all around the country are setting up checkpoints, saying, you know what, we can't rely on the government to protect us, so we're going to protect ourselves. So they're setting up sort of biosecurity checkpoints, where if you want to transit into a municipality or a community, you have to pass by local sort of checkpoints, basically, without using a military word, but basically people that are giving advice and public health measures about how to take care of themselves. The Garifuna people all across the North Coast. They've been doing workshops, teaching their young people and basically the importance of medicinal plants and natural medicines to sort of build up their immune system, and also doing like community making workshops, sort of communal food programs where they're like making food communally and then delivering them to houses. And so there's like really incredible things that are also going on, and people sort of taking the lack of a government, having a legitimate government that protects them, sort of into their own hands and proposing their own public health measures and prevention measures to sort of mount their own defense against this COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to leave it there. And Terry, I'll hand it back to you. And I think there's like questions, and I'm not sure if there's any questions at all, but Terry, before we close down, I wanted, and in case I forgot, I wanted to thank you, Terry, thank Code Pink for having me and for always staying really on Honduras and Honduras work, and for also coordinating delegations down to Honduras. We need to stay on Honduras and stay on the solidarity there, even though it's a really hard country to sort of see that there's any sort of immediate change in. So thanks, Terry.
Well, thank you. Just what an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with you this afternoon. If you have time, I mean, I know I represented to you, this program is generally 20 to 30 minutes, including Q&A, and I've had you in conversation for about 45 minutes now, but there are a couple of follow-up things I hope you have some time for. I think first, just my own personal comment, listening to you describe how private society, particularly, you know, the more impoverished segments of private society, how they're creating their own response to COVID-19, and the growing, the re-emergence of the social movements, how that's almost like a parallel government being created in a sense. And that may be too strong of a statement for me, but for me to say, but you can see these two clear delineations of who's helping whom and with which resources, almost two separate countries in a way.
Oh, absolutely. People are just saying, you know what, we have to do this ourselves. Like, we can't depend on the government. The Garifuna people are like, you know what? No, like, we don't want anything from the government. If the government comes in here to do epidemiological things, they need to be accompanied by leaders in the community to ensure that they're doing it correctly, that it's being done correctly, to respect our communities and respect our territories. And I mean, that goes back to the resistance in Honduras, you know, the defense of territories. You know, this builds on already like resistance that's already existed in Honduras for several years. So you're right. It's like people are just saying, you know what, forget the central government. In so many ways, we need to do this ourselves. And it's very inspiring.
So I have a couple follow-up comments here from viewers. One, and these have come in, same question, comment from multiple people, so let's focus on these first. One is, how are deportations from the United States affecting COVID-19 among the Honduras population?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I'm glad people asked about it. So deportation flights are continuing. Actually, CEPR put out a report, I think yesterday or a few days ago, saying that since February 3rd, there's been 18 deportation flights to Honduras, and also shows that there's been other ones to Guatemala as well, and other countries. So the deportation flights continue. But what's so messed up about that, Terry, is that like the deportation flights, a lot of them go into San Pedro Sula. And in San Pedro Sula, that's a COVID-19 epicenter. And these people that are being held, in these outrageous conditions in the United States are being put in a plane in a confined space, and they're being taken to countries that don't have the ability to respond to a pandemic, don't have the ability or the political will to sort of support migrants. And they're being taken to San Pedro Sula. Some of them are being taken to government quarantine, which is also concerning because, again, there's really no trust that the government is implementing the adequate measures to sort of ensure that people are not getting COVID-19 while they're in quarantine, government quarantine, or that there's adequate supplies to even treat people that might be deported, that are being sent to quarantine. But what I think for me, one of the most important thing that was like majorly, alarming to me was, you know, the Safe Third Country Agreement just came into effect in Honduras, like 2 days before Honduras locked down their borders. And so that opened up a whole new number of deportations that can be sent to Honduras at a time that Honduras can't respond to, you know, the pandemic, let alone people that are coming from detention centers where there's COVID-19 in the United States. And so that's really concerning. And on a local level, people at the beginning of the pandemic in La Lima, where the airport, the San Pedro Sula airport is located, where a lot of these deportation flights are coming in, started saying, you know what, we need to lock down these airports. We can't let these flights in because, you know, how do we know the government's adequately protecting the local population where these airports are? And then let alone, you know, the health of the people that are coming in those planes. And one more thing to mention as well that people would want to know, I think, if they hadn't already seen this, is that when they were evacuating Americans from Honduras, they were sending ICE planes with people that were being deported back to Honduras and then loading up those ICE deportation planes with Americans and taking them back to the United States. I mean, it's like totally cynical. And it's so concerning because it's a huge public health issue.
Wow, I mean, you know, for everyone, when you frame it that way, I mean, for everyone, both directions of that flight and on both ends of the, you know, the flight plan. I have something here from our good friend Judy Ansel with Cross Border Network in Kansas City, who we worked on delegations to Honduras with. And Judy's question is, can you talk more about what's happening with workers in the maquila export factories?
Sure. So there's a lot. So I'll try and keep it as short as possible. The different factories and different companies are responding differently. But like I mentioned, the COVID epicenter in Honduras is right where a lot of these factories that are US sweatshop factories, apparel, you know, auto parts are located. And so there's been different responses from different companies, and we're in the middle of investigating this, but Hanes brand, which is a US company, and Delta Apparel is another US company. They've sort of responded differently. There's also Gildan Activewear, which is a Canadian company. So they defied the lockdown order in the beginning of when it was declared on the 15th of March. And they kept their factories open, and workers started saying, no, we can't keep working because you're not giving us biosecurity protections or any sort of prevention, you know, they're not implementing any prevention measures in the factories. So they started protesting that there was no safety measures and that they were being called to work despite the lockdown, and they had to cross the checkpoints in order to get to work when the government was telling them to stay at home. Their jobs were saying, if you don't come to work, we're going to fire you. And so, you know, and so eventually the sweatshops, a lot of the sweatshops closed down. It's not a complete sort of, not all of them did, but in general, most of them did. And so they've closed down some of them down. They're pressuring the government to reopen the factories. And some of them are basically laying off full-time workers, or they're taking away their vacation days, and they're not paying them. And so that's obviously a big concern because, I mean, a lot of those people rely on their jobs, and they need those jobs to be able to feed their families in a very sort of immediate sense. They don't work in one day, then they can't necessarily eat. And so there's a lot of concerns about how these companies aren't providing the correct prevention measures, how they weren't following the lockdown, and how they're pressuring the government to reopen, but there's really no faith that they're going to be implementing the proper mechanisms to protect them. Judy and I were actually looking into the fact that Hanes brand, which is a US company, got a contract from the Trump administration to make masks to export to the United States. And so that's another big issue as well, because there's not enough masks in Honduras. And again, the company's prioritizing exporting those masks to the United States when there's not enough in Honduras itself, and workers aren't being given the proper equipment to even go into the factories to work to make those masks. So there's a lot there.
Masks are being exported to the wealthy nation.
Right.
You and Judy wrote a recent article, like this week, I think, on this issue, I believe. Did I not read that, like in labor notes or something I saw?
Yep, it's called Corona Capitalism in Honduras. It's by Judy Ansel and myself, and Labor Notes published, I think it was last week, or I can't remember the exact date, but
I'll post
people
it
can
on
also
our,
read. Yeah, that'd be great.
Post it on our Good Neighbor Policy Facebook page, our new code campaign. I think I remember reading, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was in your article as you're talking about these layoffs that were happening in the maquilas, that full-time workers are being laid off and the companies have the option to replace them with 90-day labor that has no benefits. No, I think that was.
Yeah, actually, in my conversations with the union leader in the bottling union, that sort of bottles all Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola products and also all the sort of national beers in Honduras, he was talking about how some of the companies, these transnational companies, are using this opportunity to lay off workers that don't want to go to work because there's not enough safety in the factories and they can't cross the checkpoints, or they don't want to cross the checkpoints and risk arrest. And they were being laid off because they weren't showing up to work out of fear for their safety, and then they were hiring temp workers. So basically eliminating unionized workers and hiring temp workers. This temporary labor law that was passed after the 2009 coup as sort of like a shock sort of neoliberal policy that basically said, we'll give you 90 days of employment, it's temporary, there's no benefits or anything, you're a contract worker, and then we lay you off. So what a lot of the companies do is they hire people under the 90-day labor law, and then they fire them after 90 days, and then they rehire them for another 90 days so that there's no commitment to them. And so this is another thing that transnational companies are doing in Honduras as well.
All over the world. Coming to a country near you soon, I would argue.
Yeah, it's global neoliberalism.
Exactly. And that is a really, maybe a good thing for us to end on. And I want to talk about a few things we had planned for May with the Honduras Solidarity Network. But I think, one of the very first things you and I did together was show, or maybe hosted you on a speaking tour, we showed the film La Resistencia. And do you remember that? And in that film, earlier we were talking about the privatization of Honduras and now transnational corporations and the government right after the coup, the Lobo government, specifically, and there's a great scene in that film where he says Honduras is open for business. And I mean, that has been the principal paradigm oath of Honduras ever since. I mean, really for the last 100 years, but as far as open to U.S. corporate interests and transnational interests, that said it all in that film.
Yeah.
It's a really good film to watch. I would encourage all of you to
definitely.
watch it if you haven't. So let me just tell all of you, we at Code Pink, we had been endorsed, co-sponsored, been working with Alliance for Global Justice and the Honduras Solidarity Network to sponsor a delegation to Honduras in mid-May. That has been postponed but not canceled. So we would encourage all of you to visit all three of those, our websites, Code Pink, AFGJ.org, HSN.org, and check back to see when we reschedule that delegation. I highly encourage all of you to go, especially if you've never been. And Karen does a fantastic job if we can get you back into the country. She does an amazing job organizing and leading trips, and I'm just so honored to call you my friend and co-worker in activism. So anything else we should say before I let you go?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I mentioned some inspiring things going on in Honduras, the Garifuna people, and actually next week, the Honduras Solidarity Network is going to do a webinar, which we haven't announced yet. So this is Miriam Miranda, who's the leader of a really, really well-respected leader of the Garifuna people and the social movement in Honduras. She is going to speak to us on May 6th through an HSN webinar, which hopefully Code Pink will also sponsor it maybe. She's going to talk about what the Garifuna communities are doing with COVID-19 and prevention measures. I mentioned some, but it's always different hearing it from somebody that is so deeply involved in her communities all across the North Coast. So I encourage people to stay like, just watch our Facebook and our Twitter for that. And we really hope it's a success, because we really want to get out what Ofrene is doing and what Miriam is doing with COVID-19 in Honduras.
So great, thank you, Karen. And I want to share with you and our viewers that today was a really special conversation for all of us here on WTF's going on in Latin America. We just launched a new campaign. Our Latin America team launched a campaign last week on Code Pink Radio called a Good Neighbor Policy. And what this is kind of a revitalization of a policy that came out of the New Deal era with FDR. And although it's, you know, a modern day version, and we're looking at how to make U.S. foreign policy more neighborly, so to speak. And Honduras has been a really good example of how the U.S. is not being a good neighbor, especially when we see that juxtaposed to, you know, what other countries in the hemisphere are doing, specifically Cubans with their medical brigades. And that is completely the antithesis of the behavior we're seeing of the United States and Honduras at this point in history. So I just want to encourage all of you to investigate our new campaign. We have a Facebook page dedicated to this campaign, Code Pink New Neighbor Policy, and we'll be talking more about that. But thank you, Karen. It's just really, really great to see you and talk with you. And I look forward to doing some more work together. And let's talk about that webinar with Miriam. That's just, wow, wonderful that you were able to secure some time from her.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Terry. It's again, thank you. It's an honor to be be on this program, and thanks for your work and Code Pink's work and support, and as a member of the Honduras Solidarity Network. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And viewers, you can catch us next week on Code Pink YouTube, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to catch Code Pink Radio tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern on WBAI in New York. Generally, we simulcast with WTF in DC, but they've got a jazz fest tomorrow. So, and then be sure to go to codepink.org and check out all of our webinars from across the globe on various COVID-19 responses and all of our anti-war work. Okay, thanks again.
Thanks, Terry.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Yep, take care.